It weakens the individuals involved and simultaneously undermines the institution's reputation. Is it a coincidence that doubts about his ability to assert himself repeatedly surfaced, even though the underlying causes lay elsewhere? This section illustrates how William begins to redefine responsibility. It is no longer enough to act correctly and rely on formal processes. Anyone operating within such a structure must also understand who controls these processes. This realization is uncomfortable because it demands closer scrutiny and an end to avoiding conflict. William senses that neutrality is virtually impossible in a system of covert manipulation. Those who remain silent unintentionally reinforce the existing power structures. At the same time, the internal pressure mounts. William knows that every movement, every inquiry is now being observed. The network that has detected the manipulation continues to exist. It reacts to changes, adapts. This tension lends the section an underlying drama. This isn't about an open confrontation, but about the awareness that every step can have consequences. Can such a system be changed from within without making it public? Or is transparency the only way to dismantle covert power? This section doesn't end with a solution, but with a sharpening of the situation. William now understands that the problem doesn't lie solely with individuals, but with the way power is distributed and exercised covertly. This realization marks a turning point. Initial doubt gives way to an analytical clarity that leaves no room for naive explanations. The reader is invited to consider parallels, not only in the context of the monarchy, but wherever formal structures and informal power diverge. It is precisely this transferability that makes the section so effective and propels the story forward. The clearer the structures behind the power shifts become, the more painfully William realizes that these dynamics don't remain abstract, but reach deep into the private sphere. The family, which is supposed to embody external closedness and stability, proves to be particularly vulnerable to targeted manipulation within. Trust and loyalty are not givens here, but resources that can be exploited. William is beginning to understand that this personal level is precisely the most effective arena for control. At the heart of the matter is the relationship between William and Charles. For years, there had been periods of distance, which both sides interpreted as a consequence of strain, a sense of duty and public pressure. Now this distance appears in a new light. Decisions that were considered natural estrangement suddenly seem like the result of deliberate shielding. Information that was withheld, opportunities for rapprochement that vanished. This realization is particularly difficult for William to bear because it has not only political but also profoundly human consequences. How many unspoken misunderstandings have solidified during this time? Catherine, too, is increasingly in the spotlight. Her role within the family and the institution is characterized by discipline, restraint, and loyalty. Yet these very qualities make her vulnerable to subtle interference. Her initiatives lose visibility. Her presence becomes quieter, without any clear explanation. Outwardly, it appears as a voluntary withdrawal. Inwardly, as a creeping marginalization. William recognizes that this dynamic affects not only her work but also her reputation and her long-term position within the monarchy. The text vividly illustrates how familial ties can be used as leverage. Conflicts don't need to be openly waged to be effective. It is enough to perceive insecurity, undermine trust, and isolate people from one another. For William, this raises a painful question. How can one demand loyalty when it is being secretly eroded? And how does one protect relationships when one fails to recognize for a long time that they are being deliberately strained? The emotional dimension of this passage is crucial. William is not only the heir to the throne but also a son and husband who recognizes that closeness has been systematically hindered. This realization changes his perspective on the past. Memories are re-evaluated, decisions re-evaluated. What once seemed like personal failure or a lack of communication turns out to be part of a larger context. This doesn't bring relief but rather a mixture of grief and responsibility. Grief for lost time, responsibility for what follows. At the same time, it becomes clear how difficult it is to openly name such mechanisms. Different rules apply within the family than in formal institutions. Loyalty is not only expected here, but morally charged. Criticism is quickly perceived as disloyalty, questions as mistrust. William senses that it is precisely these unspoken expectations that stabilize the system. Those who want to maintain peace remain silent. But what happens when this peace is based on manipulation? Is it then even worth protecting? This section intensifies the tension by showing that William is increasingly caught between two roles. On the one hand, familial cohesion, and on the other, the duty to protect the institution from harm. These roles can no longer be easily reconciled. Every decision in one direction means a loss in the other. The reader is confronted with this inner conflict, and invited to ask themselves where the line between patience and responsibility lies. At the end of this section, everything culminates in a quiet but unmistakable turning point. William recognizes the silence, realizing that he himself has long been a part of the problem, acting as a form of self-protection. The family is not only a victim of these dynamics but also their catalyst. Anyone who wants to prevent intimacy only needs to operate in the background long enough. This insight makes it clear that the coming steps are inevitable. The question is no longer whether action must be taken, but how openly and consistently this step can be taken. It is precisely this uncertainty that propels the story forward and keeps the reader in the tension between personal pain and institutional responsibility. The point at which repression is no longer possible does not come abruptly, but as a logical consequence of what William has come to understand. The insights gained over the past few weeks have solidified into an inner pressure that leaves no room for excuses. What previously appeared as a complex web of hints and assumptions now lies clearly before him, not as an emotional accusation, but as a structural problem that can no longer be ignored. William realizes that hesitation at this stage no longer signifies prudence, but rather capitulation. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that the existing mechanisms continue to operate as if nothing had happened. Decisions are still being prepared, deadlines set, and procedures followed. Outwardly, everything appears stable, almost routine. But it is precisely this normality that intensifies the inner conflict. William now knows that every seemingly harmless continuation of daily life contributes to maintaining a system based on covert control. The question that increasingly preoccupies him is no longer whether intervention is justified, but whether continued silence can even be morally defensible. Camilla remains a constant presence in the background, not through open confrontation, but through her presence and self-evidence. Her role is firmly established, her closeness to Charles, her influence visible, seemingly legitimized by routine and habit. This is precisely what makes the situation so precarious. A break at this point would not only mean a personal conflict, but an attack on an established equilibrium. William is aware that any movement against this order will be perceived as destabilizing. But he also recognizes that stability based on manipulation cannot last in the long run. This section illustrates how William's attitude changes. The observant analyst becomes someone who actively accepts responsibility. This development is not an emotional outburst, but a sober decision. William begins to openly consider the possible consequences. The impact on Charles, on Catherine, on the public perception of the monarchy. He knows that transparency does not automatically mean consent, and that truth often creates more unrest than silence. But he also recognizes that precisely this unrest may be necessary to prevent long-term damage. This turning point becomes particularly clear in his internal struggle between loyalty and duty. Loyalty to the family had long taken precedence, but now it becomes apparent that this loyalty has been abused to exert control and shift responsibility. William understands that true loyalty does not consist of covering up problems, but of addressing them openly, even if it is painful. This insight gives the section a clear direction. The focus shifts from the question of personal harm to responsibility towards the institution and the public. The text further builds tension by emphasizing the isolation of this moment. William stands largely alone with his decision. The formal structures offer him no clear path. Familial expectations no protection. He must define for himself where the line lies. This solitude is not a sign of weakness, but part of the burden that comes with his position. The reader senses that this is not a dramatic act being prepared, but an irreversible turning point. At the same time, the passage opens up space for strategic considerations. William recognizes that an uncontrolled break could do more harm than good. It is not about publicly denouncing guilt, but about redistributing responsibility. This distinction is crucial. The turning point lies not in the scandal, but in the conscious decision to no longer passively accept existing processes. Transparency is not understood here as an end in itself, but as a necessary means to restore trust. At the end of this passage, there is no public act, but an inner clarity. William now knows that there is no going back. The situation demands decisive action, not compromises that merely buy time. The reader is left with a central question. How often is stability mistaken for silence in large institutions, and what is the cost? This question resonates beyond the text itself, paving the way for the next steps, in which inner decisions must translate into outward action. With inner clarity comes the challenge of translating these insights into institutional action. William understands that the monarchy, however stable it may appear outwardly, rests on trust and clear structures. Any manipulation, any covert influence, undermines this foundation. It is no longer about personal feelings or familial loyalties, but about the survival of the institution. The decisions that now follow must be carefully prepared, for they touch upon both the right to power and public perception. The necessity of involving the king's advisors introduces a further layer of tension. These experienced figures are familiar with the traditions and the legal possibilities, yet many of them have previously only perceived fragments of reality. For them, the situation is new, even though they have long suspected subtle clues. William systematically presents the evidence, laying out documents, records, and summaries. It becomes clear how much planning, patience, and strategic thinking are required to accurately convey the situation without immediately triggering chaos. The legal dimension is particularly delicate. Removing a queen consort is an extremely rare occurrence in history, and always encounters immense resistance. William must carefully weigh the options: legal frameworks, public impact, international attention, and the long-term consequences for the reputation of the monarchy. Every step must be traceable, every decision legally sound. The institution demands precision, but the pressure mounts because time is no ally. At the same time, William feels the emotional pressure from his father. Charles, who has long ignored the situation through silence and cautious restraint, now stands as a witness to a profound truth, facing a choice: intervention or continued unconscious complicity. William recognizes that the responsibility of his actions also lies in making Charles aware of the consequences without breaking him. The power struggles behind the scenes come to the fore, but now with the prospect of ending them and establishing transparency. The section also shows how the preparations for the public disclosure are proceeding. Communications teams, lawyers, and advisors are working hand in hand to ensure that every wording is precise, understandable, and legally sound. William himself oversees every step, checks every phrase, and weighs every word. The need to maintain a balance between truth and stability is a constant thread running through the planning. It's not about sensationalism, but about saving the monarchy's credibility. Meanwhile, the effects of the measures are unfolding behind the scenes. The hidden networks that Camilla had built are beginning to unravel. Loyalties that previously seemed stable are shifting as soon as the evidence becomes tangible. The power that operated in secret for years is losing its foundation. The story begins with a question that lands like a blow in the silence. What happens when the foundations of a seemingly unshakable institution suddenly show cracks that no one was supposed to see? For William, this moment arrives early on a morning that, outwardly, appears as unremarkable as many others in the palace. And yet, it is precisely this morning that changes everything. Behind the thick walls that have symbolized continuity and stability for centuries, he stumbles upon clues that fundamentally shake his understanding of loyalty, family, and responsibility. It is not a single discovery, not an isolated detail, but a chain of information that together paints a picture that can no longer be ignored. William quickly realizes that what lies before him did not arise by chance. The documents, the internal memos, the overlapping dates, everything points to a pattern. A pattern that is neither loud nor overt, but quietly disciplined and built up over a long period. In this moment, an unsettling realization begins to take shape. The palace, which he had known all his life as a place of clear roles and reliable structures, apparently also operates according to other rules. Rules that are not openly spoken, but operate in the shadows. How many decisions, he wonders, were made without him ever knowing the whole truth? As William sorts through the individual clues, he realizes how often he had had an uneasy feeling in the past, without being able to put his finger on it. Missed deadlines, shifted priorities, initiatives that came to nothing. He had accepted all of this as part of the complex system in which tradition and modernity constantly clash. But now these experiences appear in a new light. What if these apparent coincidences were in fact deliberately orchestrated? What if, behind the facade of order, a strategic game was being played that went far beyond ordinary power struggles? Particularly troubling for William is the realization that these events do not only involve abstract processes, but very real people. Catherine, whose dedication and discipline are evident like almost no one else, keeps reappearing in these contexts. Meetings where her presence was reduced, projects that appeared delayed or watered down. All of this suddenly no longer seems like bureaucratic inertia, but rather part of a deliberate dynamic. William feels how initial irritation transforms into a mixture of anger and responsibility. Because if these mechanisms are real, then they affect not only his position but the integrity of the entire family. The text draws the reader in at precisely this point by offering no easy answers. Instead, a tension unfolds between a sense of duty and personal doubt. William is exemplary of someone who has learned to exercise restraint, accept complexity, and avoid escalating conflicts prematurely. But the clearer the connections become, the more apparent it is that silence is no longer a neutral option. Can stability be maintained by looking away? Or is this very turning a blind eye the reason why structures are eroded from within? The passage thrives on this inner turmoil. William is not the impulsive rebel, but the thoughtful observer who understands that every action and every inaction has consequences. The provocative power of the introduction lies in the fact that it requires no spectacular scene. It is the creeping realization that trust may have been abused that triggers the real shock. The palace appears here not as a romantic symbol, but as a complex power structure in which loyalties are tested and boundaries shifted. At the end of this first section, everything culminates in a central question that hangs in the air and drives the subsequent narrative. If someone recognizes that something is fundamentally wrong, how long can they hesitate before caution becomes complicity? William stands on the threshold of a decision that could change not only his own life, but the perception of the monarchy as a whole. The reader is invited to think along, to weigh the options, and to ask themselves how they would act in such a situation. This is precisely where the captivating power of this opening lies. It compels us to look more closely and to question the comfortable surface. What initially appears only as a sense of unease now develops into a clear picture of systematic manipulation. William begins to view the individual pieces of the puzzle not in isolation, but as part of a long-term power structure. It's not about spontaneous decisions or personal misunderstandings, but about recurring patterns that unfold over months and years. The deeper he delves into these processes, the clearer it becomes that power in the palace is exercised not only through official positions, but also through the control of information, timing, and access. What's striking is how subtly these mechanisms operate. There are no open commands, no public conflicts, but rather small shifts. Meetings are rescheduled, responsibilities reinterpreted, priorities quietly adjusted. To outsiders, such changes seem harmless, almost banal, yet in their totality, they create a clear direction. William realizes that this very invisibility is the key. Whoever controls the process without being visible evades responsibility and criticism. And therein lies the true power. Camilla is at the center of these insights not as an open adversary, but as the node in a network that relies on loyalty, dependence, and carefully cultivated proximity. Over the years, she has cultivated a network of people who, while not officially considered her confidants, are nonetheless loyal to her. This network doesn't act against the institution, but rather utilizes it. Existing structures aren't destroyed, but redirected for her own purposes. For William, this is particularly worrying because it demonstrates how easily even established systems can be manipulated when control over the flow of information exists. As he analyzes these connections, another question arises. How many of the previous decisions were truly collectively supported, and how many were already the result of this covert influence? William recalls situations in which his own proposals encountered inexplicable resistance or seemingly lost their significance without explanation. At the time, he accepted this as a normal part of internal deliberations. Now, it appears as a deliberately engineered imbalance, a situation in which he formally bears responsibility but is effectively hampered. The external perception is particularly problematic. The monarchy thrives on the image of clear order and reliable leadership. When decisions appear contradictory to the outside world or initiatives suddenly fizzle out, not only does internal cooperation suffer, but so does public trust. William recognizes that this kind of power play is doubly dangerous. The carefully constructed mechanisms that blocked William and Catherine are collapsing. This demonstrates that institutional integrity rests on clear structures and verifiable loyalty, and that manipulations, even if they remain undetected for a long time, ultimately crumble as soon as they are exposed. At the end of this section, the bridge between inner realization and institutional action becomes visible. William has not only gathered the facts but also the courage to present them in the necessary form. The monarchy stands at a crossroads. Can it be strengthened through disclosure, or is there a risk of a short-term shock that will shake public perception? The tension no longer lies in whether action will be taken, but in how to maintain the balance between transparency, loyalty, and stability. The reader realizes that institutional responsibility is as complex as personal ties, and that every decision has long-term consequences. The revelation and the resulting measures mark both the end of an era of silence and the beginning of a painful but necessary healing process. William recognizes that the monarchy can only survive if the truth comes to light, even if this creates short-term unrest and tests loyalties. It is a moment where personal feelings, familial bonds, and institutional responsibility collide, and William must navigate the fine line between disclosure and stability. Camilla, whose influence seemed unchallenged for years, is now experiencing the consequences of her strategies. The networks she built as advisors and associates are disintegrating, and she is beginning to reassess her own position. Isolation and mistrust are replacing the loyalty and control that once existed. She tries to maintain her routine, but it becomes clear that the power based on covert manipulation is crumbling as soon as the truth comes to light. The dynamics demonstrate how quickly informal power erodes when subjected to scrutiny by facts, documentation, and witnesses. For Charles, the revelation is a profound emotional shock, but also an opportunity for genuine reconciliation with his son and Catherine. Long-lost conversations can now take place, misunderstandings can be cleared up, and trust can be rebuilt under new, clearer conditions. It is not an easy process. The vulnerabilities are numerous, and the wounds of the past still sting. Yet, it is precisely in this confrontation with the truth that a foundation is laid for renewed relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. William and Catherine form the stable backbone during this period. Their partnership, previously threatened by subtle manipulation, now proves to be a resilient force. Catherine acts as a calming influence, a thoughtful voice amidst the chaos. She supports William in presenting the facts, organizing the formal processes, and maintaining emotional stability within the family. This united front underscores the importance of personal bonds in overcoming institutional challenges and highlights the central role of loyalty and partnership in power and responsibility. The inevitable media attention presents the monarchy with a new dimension of challenge. William must ensure that information is communicated accurately and respectfully to protect the institution's reputation. At the same time, he must consider public opinion, which is increasingly demanding transparency and accountability. Balancing openness with protecting the family is complex, yet it becomes crucial for securing long-term trust in the monarchy. Finally, William reflects on the lessons learned from this crisis. The truth, however painful, is inextricably linked to the responsibility he bears as heir to the throne. He recognizes that protecting the institution sometimes means exposing hurtful realities, that integrity is more important than short-term peace, and that personal sacrifices are necessary to safeguard the greater good. The monarchy begins to build on a foundation of openness, accountability, and renewed clarity, making it more resilient and future-proof. The reader gains the impression that, even within the seemingly immutable structures of power, truth, courage, and responsibility are the crucial forces that enable stability and progress. The dramatic events within the British monarchy reveal how close personal relationships, power structures, and institutional responsibility are intertwined. William stumbles upon secret documents that reveal a systematic web of covert influence by Camilla. These revelations not only alter his understanding of loyalty and trust, but also demonstrate how subtly and effectively power can be wielded behind the scenes. Decisions that appear harmless on the surface turn out to be deliberate manipulations that block his own projects and weaken Catherine's role. The text makes it clear that stability without transparency is fragile, and that silence in such a system effectively perpetuates abuses. The revelations affect family relationships, particularly between William Charles and Catherine. Long-lost lines of communication, misunderstandings, and deliberately postponed attempts at reconciliation are exposed, and William realizes that many strained situations did not arise by chance. This realization compels him to take responsibility and implement measures of enormous emotional and institutional consequence. In this context, loyalty does not mean overlooking problems, but addressing them openly, even if this exacerbates conflicts in the short term. Institutionally, the monarchy faces the challenge of maintaining public trust and the stability of its structures. William integrates experienced advisors, lawyers, and communications teams to present the evidence objectively and precisely. It becomes clear that transparency and legal due diligence must go hand in hand to minimize the risk of misinterpretation. At the same time, it reveals how easily informal networks can exert power and how crucial verifiable loyalty and clear communication channels are to prevent manipulation. The confrontation with Camilla, who attempts to defend her position, highlights the complexity of power, personality, and public roles. Her influence wanes as the underlying mechanisms become visible, demonstrating that even networks built over years are unstable when exposed to facts and documentation. William and Catherine provide a stable counterbalance, and their collaboration shows that partnership, clear communication, and mutual support are essential for overcoming institutional challenges. Ultimately, a perspective of healing and new beginnings emerges. Charles, William, and Catherine begin to rebuild lost trust and place the monarchy on a foundation of honesty, accountability, and transparency. The crisis has exposed not only the institution's weaknesses but also its necessary strengths. Sie Zeit, das die Monarchie nur durch mütiges Handeln, offengang und verantwortliches Management langfristig stabil bleiben kann. Die Ergebnis bieten einen Einblick, wie macht, Family und Verantwortung ineinander greifen und das Ex stark aus der Bereitschaft entsteht, schwierige Wahrheiten anzunehmen und daraus helfen. Die Geschichte lat den Leser ein, über eigene Vorstellungen von Loyalität, macht und Verantwortung nachzudenken. Welch Kompromiss sind in einer Institution notwendig? Welch Entscheidungen müssen transparent sein? Und wen det der Schutz der Family, wenn auf Täuschung beruht? Dies Reflexionen erzigen nicht nur Spannung, sondern fordern ein tiefergehende Auseinandersetzung mit dem Thema macht und Moral. William Zeit, das mit und Integrität die entscheidenden Faktoren sind, Vertrauen wiederherzustellen und die Zukunft.